Light a deep. Hello everyone, wishing you all good health and peace in life. Love doesn't always come in grand declarations or perfect words. Sometimes it speaks through quiet actions, the kind done without asking for praise, only hoping to bring a smile to the one we love. After all the distance, the pain, and the longing, CEO James didn't say much. Instead, he built something with his own hands and heart, a new house for Tu Diep. A place filled not with luxury, but with care, memories, and a silent promise you will never be alone again. When Tu Diep saw it, she didn't need to ask why. Her tears spoke the answer. Because love like this doesn't need words. Will this new beginning bring joy back into her life? Only time will tell. But for now, it begins with a door quietly opened and a heart finally at peace. The morning mist still lingered on the hills when James stood alone on a quiet plot of land, his shoes coated in fresh soil. The air smelled of dew, grass, and possibilities. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and thought of her, Tu Diep, the girl who once stood silently in the corner of a bustling market, with a basket full of homegrown vegetables and eyes full of quiet strength. She never asked for anything, never demanded, and perhaps that's why James was now here, overseeing something she didn't even know he was building, her dream. After months of chaos, business betrayals, near bankruptcy, and a dangerous operation across the border, James had finally returned to some sense of peace. But peace meant little if Diep was still living alone, back in the same old, run-down farmhouse where she once hid from the world, her hands rough from the soil and her heart still learning how to heal. She had told him, shyly, that she liked simple things, the chirping of birds in the morning, the smell of earth after rain, the sound of wind rustling through banana leaves. She didn't want luxury. She didn't even want to leave her small world. But James had seen the broken roof, the walls barely standing, the cold silence that wrapped around her old house like a forgotten memory. He didn't say much to her. He just listened. Then, quietly, he began planning. Day after day, he visited the land near her old house, still surrounded by fields, still close to the market she loved, but a little safer, a little warmer. He worked with local builders, shows wood that breathed, windows that opened to morning sun, and built a small, charming home with a porch for her to sit and listen to the wind, a little kitchen where she could boil tea, and a quiet room with wide windows facing the sunrise. Everything was built with her in mind, even the small garden in the back, already planted with her favorite vegetables. No one knew, not even Diep. When the house was done, James didn't send flowers or messages. He simply brought her there one quiet afternoon. "Where are we going?" she asked, eyes wide, her hands clinging to the straps of her woven bag. "You'll see," he said with a soft smile. They walked in silence until she saw it, the little house standing modestly between two gentle hills. Her breath caught. "Whose house is that?" she whispered. James turned to her and said, "Yours." For a moment, Diep stood still, then her lips trembled. Her eyes, those strong yet vulnerable eyes, began to fill with tears. "You built this for me," she said. He didn't answer with words. He simply reached into his pocket and placed a single key in her hand. She looked down at it, then back at the house, her house, and suddenly she was crying, truly crying, for the first time in a long while. He let her cry. He let her feel it. Because love, he believed, was never about how loudly you declared it. It was in what you were willing to do quietly, simply, fully, for someone who had never asked. Later that evening, James sat on the porch while Diep explored the house like a child seeing magic for the first time. The sun dipped below the hills, casting golden light across the fields. She came out, eyes still red, but smiling. "This is the first place that's ever felt like mine," she said softly, sitting beside him. James looked at her. Then it was worth everything, and in that moment, without a single "I love you" spoken, Diep knew he had already said it 1,000 times with his actions. The first night in her new home was one Diep would never forget. The walls were still scented with fresh paint and new wood, yet they didn't feel foreign. There was a quiet familiarity to everything. The soft curtains that danced in the breeze, the warm tones of the floor, the delicate arrangement of dried wildflowers in the corner. She ran her fingers gently across the table, her eyes soft with wonder. James had noticed everything about her, her tastes, her habits, even the way she liked the light to fall into the room. She stood by the window, hugging herself as the moonlight cast silver shadows on the garden James had planted: lettuce, basil, mint, and was that papaya? She laughed softly to herself. He really paid attention. From outside, she heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. James was sitting on the steps of the porch, his jacket draped over his shoulders, quietly watching the stars. Without thinking, she walked out and sat beside him. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Too okay. That's the problem." He tilted his head, confused. "I'm not used to being thought of like this," she whispered. "Being loved like this." James was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't do this so you'd love me more." She looked at him. "I did it because I already love you," he said simply. "I did it because you deserve to feel safe. You deserve a space that brings you peace." Diep blinked rapidly, her throat tightening. They sat like that, side by side, wrapped in silence and moonlight, until she finally leaned her head gently against his shoulder. The new house quickly became her sanctuary. Each morning, she woke up to the soft chirping of birds, brewed tea in the little clay kettle James had chosen just for her, and walked barefoot in the garden. James visited often, sometimes with fruit, sometimes with new vegetable seeds, and sometimes with nothing but his quiet presence. He never rushed her. He never forced conversations. He simply showed up. One morning, he brought a surprise, a small wooden crate with a handwritten note, "To make your mornings sweeter." Inside were 3 little ducklings, chirping, fluffy, and full of energy. Diep burst out laughing, her heart light for the first time in what felt like forever. "You remembered I used to raise ducks when I was a child?" James grinned. "Of course I did." One late afternoon, as they sat beneath the mango tree behind the house, James looked more serious than usual. "I may have to travel for a while," he said. Diep's smile faded. "Is it because of the company?" He nodded. "There are things I need to fix, people I need to face." She didn't ask questions. She knew what kind of storm he had been through, and she knew, from the way he sometimes stared off into the distance, that there were still ghosts he hadn't yet laid to rest. "Will you come back?" she asked, a voice almost a whisper. James turned to her, took her hand, and held it between both of his. "I'm not going anywhere permanently," he said. "This place, this house, this is where I return. Always." Diep nodded. She didn't cry this time. She simply squeezed his hand tighter. The house was quiet again, but not lonely. Diep had grown stronger. She learned how to fix the fence when the wind knocked it loose. She cooked new recipes James had sent her. Through handwritten letters, every few days, a delivery arrived, sometimes books, sometimes tea, sometimes nothing more than a note. "Just thinking of you, Jay." Until one day, no letters came, not for 5 days, then 10. Her heart, once calm, now beat with uncertainty. She stood in the garden, wind brushing her hair back, whispering into the hills, "Where are you, James?" Life lesson: love is shown through actions, not words. In a world where people often say, "I love you" too easily, we sometimes forget that true love is not found in words, it's found in actions. The story of James and Tu Diep is a beautiful reminder that real love does not need loud declarations. Instead, it is built quietly, patiently, and sincerely through the things we do for those we care about. James never tried to impress Tu Diep with expensive gifts or dramatic gestures. He never pressured her to say she loved him back. He simply listened. He noticed what made her smile, what made her feel safe, and what made her feel like she belonged. Then, without expecting anything in return, he built her a home, not just a house made of bricks and wood, but a place filled with warmth, peace, and quiet understanding. A place that reflected her soul. This act was not about money. It was not about status. It was about thoughtfulness, about care, about love that listens in silence and shows up when no one else does. James understood that Tu Diep, who had been through pain and hardship, didn't need grand speeches. She needed someone who saw her, all of her, and still chose to stay. Through his actions, James taught a powerful lesson. Love means choosing someone every day. Even when it's difficult, it means creating space for them to feel safe, to grow, and to be themselves. Tu Diep, on the other hand, showed us another truth, that sometimes the kindest people are also the quietest, and they may never ask for help, but they deserve it the most. She had lived a simple life, filled with hard work and quiet dreams, but because of James's steady kindness, she slowly learned to accept love, to trust, to heal. From this story, we learn that love is not about what you say. It's about how you show up. It's in remembering small details, in showing care without being asked, and in standing by someone even when they feel unworthy. The most beautiful expressions of love are often wordless, so let us not just speak of love. Let us live it with our time, our presence, and our actions. Love, when rooted in action, becomes something unshakable, something that time and distance cannot break. When James left for his business trip, he didn't promise to deep the world. He didn't say, "I'll love you forever," in a dramatic goodbye. Instead, he promised something stronger, that he would return, not just in body, but in heart. And every letter he sent, every small gift wrapped in thoughtfulness, every handwritten note with just a few words, reminded her that she was never alone. There's a special kind of comfort in knowing that someone is quietly thinking of you, even when you are apart. James taught us that consistency matters more than intensity. You don't have to shout your love from the rooftops. You just need to show up when it counts. You just need to keep showing up, even when no one's watching. In a world where relationships can feel rushed, performative, or shallow, James and Tu Diep's story is a quiet, powerful truth. Real love is patient. Real love builds. Real love endures. And Tu Diep, through her journey of learning to receive love, gives us another important lesson. Sometimes healing takes time. People who have been hurt in the past may not trust easily. They may reject help even when they need it most. But with patience, kindness, and actions that speak louder than words, even the most guarded hearts can learn to open again. Love is not always a grand moment. Sometimes it's just building a small house in the hills for someone who loves silence. Sometimes it's remembering how they like their tea. Sometimes it's not saying anything at all and just sitting next to them when they're too tired to speak.